A man who fixes other people's broken cars doesn't belong here. Is that really what you think of me? Get out. I'm not saying it again. Her mother tossed my duffel bag onto the gravel without a single word. Yaw Darko slid into the passenger seat and adjusted his cufflink like he'd already won something he'd been working toward for a very long time. I watched their black SUV roll toward the security booth at the entrance of Aburi Manor. The guard looked at his tablet. He scanned the guest list. Nothing. Amara pointed back at me through the window, her red fingernails stabbing the air. The guard scanned again. Then he stepped out of the booth and straightened his jacket. The main gate swung open, but not for her. Behind the gatehouse, the identification screen lit up with 4 words in plain white letters. Every guard and every camera in that driveway went completely still. My wife had just thrown the owner of this estate out of her car. If you're new here, hit subscribe before this story goes any further, because what happens next inside those gates is something you'll want to see through to the end. I've spent the last 14 years running a small repair garage in the industrial district of Accra. Hoists, engine oil, welding sparks, hands permanently stained with grease no soap could fully remove. I fixed what other people had given up on. Taxis that had seen 20 Accra dry seasons, delivery vans that coughed through the rains, a senator's Mercedes that 3 other mechanics had called beyond saving. My colleagues called it honest work. Amara, in the last year of our marriage, called it a hobby that smelled like diesel. She wasn't always like that. I want to be honest about that, because it's easy, too easy, to look back at a marriage that ended on a gravel driveway and decide the whole thing was broken from the start. It wasn't. 12 years ago, the night Amara's father was rushed to Corlebu after a heart attack, I drove 3 hours through a rainstorm without calling ahead. She didn't ask me to come. I just went. I sat beside her in that hospital corridor until 4 in the morning, not saying much, not doing anything heroic, just being there. She told me later that was the moment she knew she wanted to marry me. Not because I was impressive, because I showed up. The man she married lived in a rented 2-bedroom house in Dansoman, drove a 12-year-old pickup truck, and thought a good Saturday meant rebuilding a gearbox for a widow who couldn't afford a mechanic's fee. I wasn't embarrassed by any of it. I was good at what I did, and the work felt like it mattered. But somewhere between our 4th and 5th anniversary, I noticed Amara had started answering the question, "What does your husband do?" with a tight smile and a subject change. She wasn't lying. She just stopped volunteering the truth. The change in her didn't happen overnight. It came in layers, the way damage comes to a machine. Slowly enough that you almost miss it until the engine starts to knock. Her friends were buying houses in East Legon. Her colleagues were getting promoted into offices with views. Her mother, Efua, had a particular gift for calling at exactly the right moment to mention what some other woman's husband had just purchased or achieved. Amara didn't become someone different. She became someone exhausted by the distance between the life she had and the life she'd started to believe she deserved. I watched it happen and told myself it was a phase. I was wrong about that. What Amara never knew, what almost no one knew, was that my last name wasn't the whole truth of who I was. I was born Kwabena Adje. When I was 7 years old, 2 men tried to take me from my school compound in Kumasi. They were caught before they got far, but my father never forgot it. That same week, he made a decision. I would carry my mother's surname, Mensah, from that point forward. I would not appear in any public record connected to the Adje family. And I would be raised to understand the value of a life built by your own hands rather than inherited by accident of birth. My mother passed when I was 10, and the name she had given me became the only thing of hers I carried into adulthood. My father, Nana Ose Adje, was not a man who appeared on magazine covers or gave interviews to financial journalists. He built the Adje Pan-African Group from a single cargo truck into a privately held conglomerate spanning telecommunications, energy, and port infrastructure across 17 countries. He didn't believe in celebrity. He believed in foundations you could stand on. The company's true value had never been formally published. Most people in the business world knew the name, but not the number. The number was over $1 trillion. He told me more than once, sitting in the study at Aburi Manor, that the only people worth trusting were the ones who showed up before they knew what you were worth. I visited in secret 2 or 3 times a year. My father and I would walk the trails through the avocado groves, or sit arguing about the ethics of offshore capital, or the right way to structure a scholarship fund. He taught me that money was a tool, not an identity, and that the moment you let it become your identity, it starts to own you instead. I never brought Amara, not because I didn't want her to know the truth. I'd thought about telling her dozens of times, but every time I came close to that conversation, something would happen that made me pull back. A dinner party where she laughed too loudly at a joke made at the expense of someone who couldn't afford to be in the room. A comment about a colleague's husband who had apparently wasted his potential becoming a school teacher. Small things, individually forgivable. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't know how to trust. I kept waiting for the version of Amara who'd sat with me in that hospital corridor to come back. I think I was still waiting when she met Yaw Darko. She told me it started at a marketing conference in Nairobi. A new professional contact who ran a mid-sized investment fund and was charming in the way that men who've spent years cultivating charm tend to be. Yaw began taking her to dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices. He sent gifts, not flashy ones, but well-chosen ones, the kind that signal someone has been paying very close attention to you. He told her she was operating below her level. He made her feel, in a very short period, like the central problem in her life had a name, and that name was Kwabena. What Amara didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Yaw had identified her before they ever met. His fund had been circling an energy subsidiary of the Adje Group for 2 years, making quiet inquiries that were quietly deflected each time. His research team had cross-referenced every professional contact adjacent to the group's inner network. Amara's advertising firm had handled a minor campaign for a company that shared an industry conference with one of the group's subsidiaries. Her name appeared at the edge of a very long list. That was enough for Yaw to decide she was worth pursuing. Not because he knew the full extent of my connection to the family, but because any thread leading toward Aburi was a thread worth pulling. He engineered the introduction. Everything after that was deliberate. My father found out. I didn't know it at the time, but his internal security team had flagged Yaw Darko months before Amara ever mentioned his name to me. When his analysts connected Amara to the situation, my father didn't call me. Instead, he asked Ama Sarpong, his longtime legal director, to document everything and store it on an offline drive. He told her that if something happened to him before the situation resolved itself, she would know what to do with the material. He didn't want me reacting from anger. He wanted me to see the truth clearly, with everything I needed already in hand. That was how my father operated. He didn't warn you that a storm was coming. He quietly made sure you already had shelter before it arrived. I didn't know any of that when Ama called me on a Tuesday morning in November to say my father had suffered a stroke at Aburi Manor and hadn't survived it. I sat in my pickup truck in the parking lot of a workshop I was supposed to be inspecting that day and didn't move for a long time. Whatever complicated grief I'd been quietly carrying for years, the loneliness of loving a father I couldn't publicly acknowledge, collapsed in on itself all at once. Amara came home to find me at the kitchen table. I told her I'd lost someone important, and that I needed to attend a private memorial service at a property called Aburi Manor on the Eastern Ridge. She asked if she could come. I should have said no, but I was grieving and not thinking clearly, and some part of me that still wanted to believe in the marriage said yes. She didn't ask who had died. She asked what the guest list would look like. The morning of the service, Amara hired an SUV. She was dressed in black that read more like fashion than mourning. Her mother, Efua, sat in the back seat with the settled confidence of someone who had already decided this day was an opportunity. Yaw sat beside her, jacket pressed, expression composed. I rode in the passenger seat and watched the hills of the Aquapem Range pass, and thought about the last phone call I'd had with my father 3 weeks earlier. Unremarkable. Something about a drainage project on the eastern edge of the estate. I hadn't known it would be the last one. No one in that car asked how I was doing. Amara and Yaw talked in low voices about the people they planned to approach at the service. Efua made a comment about the estate being well maintained, as though she were a prospective buyer assessing its resale value. I said nothing. I watched the iron gates of Aburi Manor appear at the end of the long approach road, and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the people sitting behind me. Then Amara stopped the car. She turned to me with the expression I'd come to recognize in the last year of our marriage. Calm on the surface, something harder underneath, and told me she needed me to switch seats with Yaw. She wanted them to enter together. When I didn't move, she opened the passenger door, looked at me directly, and said, "A man who fixes other people's broken cars doesn't belong walking through that gate. Get out." Her mother dropped my duffel bag onto the gravel. Yaw stepped out, walked around the front of the vehicle, and settled into the seat I had been removed from, without looking at me once. Amara said the marriage was over. Her voice was flat and final, the way you close an account you've decided costs more than it returns. Then she drove the SUV forward toward the security booth. The guard scanned his tablet. He looked up. He scanned again. Then he stepped back from the booth, and the main gate swung open. Not for Amara, but away from her. Mr. Boateng, my father's estate manager, came through first, moving with unhurried certainty the way he always did, followed by 6 members of the household staff. He stopped in front of me, straightened slightly, and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Kwabena." Behind him, the identification screen mounted to the gatehouse wall displayed 4 words in plain white text. Amara was still in the driver's seat. I could see her face in the rearview mirror. The expression of someone who has just realized the ground they were standing on was never ground at all. I picked up my bag. Mr. Boateng fell into step beside me, and we walked through the gate together without a word. There was nothing that needed to be said. Mr. Boateng didn't take me through the main entrance. He led me around the east wing, through the side corridor my father had always preferred, the one lined with framed photographs from the early days of the company. The first cargo truck, the first depot, the first crew standing in front of a building they'd built from nothing. I used to walk this hallway as a child and wonder what kind of man builds an empire out of a single truck. By the time I was old enough to understand, I'd already decided I didn't want to be that kind of man. My father, to his credit, never tried to convince me otherwise. The house was full of people I half recognized, faces from my father's professional world, board members, legal representatives, a few politicians whose names I knew from news coverage but had never met in person. They moved through the rooms with the particular restraint of people who understood that something significant was happening, and were performing their best version of solemnity. I moved through them without speaking. No one in that crowd knew who I was. That had always been the arrangement. Ama Sarpong met me in the hallway outside my father's private study. She was a trim woman in her late 50s, with silver hair and the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades managing enormous consequences without raising her voice. She'd been with my father for over 20 years. If anyone understood what Nana Ose Ajay had built and what it had cost him, it was Ama. She put her hand briefly on my arm, said she was sorry, and then said, "He left instructions. Before anything else today, you need to come inside." The study was exactly as I remembered it. The wide mahogany desk, the wall of books that were actually read rather than displayed, the brass clock on the mantelpiece that my father wound by hand every evening. Ama set a wooden box on the desk in front of me. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a small offline drive, and a playback device. She explained that my father had asked her to brief me on the practical contents of the letter before I read it in full. The key business instructions, the board contacts, the legal framework. She went through them methodically. Then she placed the box in front of me and said, "The rest is in his own words. Take whatever time you need." I connected the drive and pressed play. My father appeared on the small screen, seated in this same chair, in this same room. He looked older than I'd expected. Thinner, too, in a way I hadn't registered during our last phone call. He spoke without preamble, the way he always did, as though he'd already said the introductory version of this speech in his head and was moving directly to the part that mattered. He said, "I've known about Yaw Darko for longer than you have. Our security team flagged him when his fund started making quiet inquiries about the energy division. This was more than a year ago. When your wife's name appeared in the same report, I asked Ama to document everything and keep it on the offline drive." He paused, and I watched him choose his next words carefully. "I'm not telling you this because I wanted to test you or Amara. I'm telling you because I couldn't protect what I built for 50 years and then leave you to defend it blind. I didn't intervene in your marriage. That was never my place. But I could make sure that when the truth finally surfaced, you'd have everything you needed to see it clearly. And to act from a position of strength rather than shock." He looked directly at the camera before adding, "The drive contains everything. Use it the way I would have used it. Not to destroy people. To protect what matters." I sat in that chair for a long time after the recording ended. The grief I'd been managing since Tuesday morning shifted into something different. Something that had no clean name. My father had watched this coming. He had built me a shelter before the storm arrived. And he'd done it quietly, without ever making me feel managed or surveilled. That was the most Nana Ose Ajay thing he could possibly have done. Ama gave me an hour before the reading began. The library at Aburi Manor held about 60 people in the configuration they'd arranged. Chairs in rows facing a long table where Ama stood with a document folder and 2 legal associates. I found a seat near the back. Amara had positioned herself and Yaw toward the front, close to the board members, which told me she'd spent her one available hour working the room rather than thinking about what she was walking into. Efua sat beside her, posture precise, expression arranged into something designed to look like dignified grief. Ama read the disposition clearly and without editorial commentary. My father had left me the entirety of Aburi Manor and its 200 surrounding acres. He had left me 62% of the voting shares of the Ajay Pan-African Group, along with full control of the family's private investment networks, research endowments, and real estate holdings across 17 countries. The estimated total value of the estate exceeded $1 trillion. There was also a specific legal clause, drafted by Amma and signed by my father 2 years prior, stating that no spouse, relative by marriage, or external partner could access family shareholdings without a signed, written authorization from Kwabena Ajay Mensah. The room absorbed this in silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Then Amara stood up. She crossed the room and reached for my hand. Less than 2 hours ago, she had told me our marriage was over through an open car window while her mother dropped my bag into a gravel driveway. Now she was calling me darling in front of 60 strangers and explaining to Amma that as my wife, she would naturally be standing by my side during this difficult time. I withdrew my hand from hers without saying anything. The room had heard the same clause I had. Yaw attempted a different approach. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and introduced himself to Amma as a financial advisor with an interest in supporting my transition into the role. Amma looked at him the way a person looks at something they recognized some time ago and have simply been waiting to acknowledge. She said, "Mr. Darko, yes, I know that name." The particular quality of her tone made several people in the room look down at their hands. I understood in that moment the full shape of what had been assembled around my marriage. Yaw hadn't pursued Amara because she was compelling, though she was. He hadn't stayed because he felt something for her, though he may have performed that convincingly enough to fool her. He had stayed because he believed she was a door, and he had been patient, careful, and deliberate in positioning himself in front of it. That realization didn't make what Amara had done smaller, but it made it more complicated in a way I hadn't expected to feel standing in my father's library. The days that followed were not quiet. Amara requested a private conversation that evening. She said Yaw had meant nothing, that the dinners and the gifts had been professional relationship building, that the pressure of living below her potential had warped her judgment temporarily. When she saw that explanation wasn't landing, she changed direction entirely. She told me that I had built our marriage on a lie, that 12 years of concealing my father's identity constituted a fundamental betrayal, and that she had been a participant in a test she'd never agreed to take. There was enough truth in that framing to make it difficult to dismiss cleanly, and I think she knew that. Her mother backed every version of this argument with the particular conviction of someone who had never once considered that she might be wrong. Efua told anyone who would listen that the Ajay family had used Amara as an unwitting subject in some kind of social experiment, and that her daughter was the real victim of the day's events. Yaw, meanwhile, had been busy. He'd spent those same hours making calls to 3 board members who had long-standing reservations about the succession. Men who had served under my father's oversight and were skeptical, for legitimate professional reasons, about handing a $1 trillion operation to someone whose public resume consisted of repairing cars in the industrial district of Accra. He also reached Amara's laptop through means that became clear later, extracted several documents from the estate's preliminary transfer files, and altered specific passages to suggest the Ajay family had been surveilling Amara as part of a deliberate campaign against her. Those altered documents reached 3 journalists the following morning. Amara's legal team filed a court motion requesting a temporary freeze on my ability to exercise voting rights while her claim was under review. A judge granted a limited version of the order by that afternoon. Yaw moved quickly into the space that created, presenting the board with a proposed sale of the Ajay Group's energy division to an investment consortium that, as Amma would later confirm, he controlled through a series of shell arrangements. 2 board members signaled they were open to the discussion. Then, the footage from the Aburi gatehouse leaked online. The clip was 40 seconds long. Amara opening the passenger door, the bag hitting the gravel, Yaw taking my seat, the screen flashing my name. By the following morning, it had been viewed more than 40 million times. Talk shows debated whether I was a wronged husband or a manipulative billionaire who'd let his wife embarrass herself for the optics. The story had escaped every room it had started in, and was now public property that no one was managing correctly. Least of all, me. I went back to my father's study that night. I took the brass clock off the mantelpiece and held it for a while, the way I used to watch him hold it when he was working through something difficult. Then I set it down and told Amma, who was still at her desk in the adjoining room, that I wasn't sure my father had chosen the right person. A man who spent his career rebuilding engines that other people had abandoned was now supposed to govern a global conglomerate, while a court order restricted his authority. A board ally was engineering the sale of a core division. His wife was casting herself as a victim in a story the whole world was watching. And a 40-second video was being analyzed by strangers who had never set foot in this county. I told Amma I was considering stepping back from the succession entirely. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You've heard the summary. Now read all of it. Every word he wrote." She set the handwritten letter from the wooden box on the desk in front of me. Then she left the room and closed the door behind her. I opened the letter and began to read. My father's handwriting was smaller than I remembered. He'd always written in a compressed, deliberate hand, the kind that suggested every word had been chosen before the pen touched the paper. The letter was 4 pages, front and back, and I read it twice before I put it down. Most of it was practical. Instructions about specific board relationships, notes on the energy division's long-term structure, a list of the 3 people within the group he trusted without reservation. But toward the end, there was a paragraph that had nothing to do with business. He wrote, "There will be a moment when you have everything you need to ruin them completely. The evidence will be in your hands. The platform will be yours. And the temptation will feel like justice. I need you to understand that it isn't. If you use what you have to punish Amara and Yaw in front of the world, you will become exactly the man they've been describing. Cold, calculated, willing to destroy people to protect your position. That's not what I built this for, and it's not who your mother raised." He'd underlined the last sentence. I set the letter down and looked at the offline drive for a long time. Then I picked up the clock, wound it the way I'd watched my father wind it 100 times, and put it back on the mantelpiece. I went to find Amma. She was still at her desk. I told her I wasn't stepping back. I told her I needed to go through everything on that drive, all of it, and that I wanted the board meeting moved to the following morning. She looked at me without surprise, as though this were the conclusion she'd been waiting for me to reach on my own timeline. She said, "I'll make the calls." We spent the rest of that night going through the contents of the offline drive together. The documentation was thorough in the way that only a man with 20 years of institutional resources and a very particular concern could make it. There were communication logs, transaction records, and a series of emails between Yaw and 2 board members that laid out, in plain business language, the structure of the proposed sale and the specific conditions under which each party would benefit. There was also a complete recording from the gatehouse security system. Not the 40-second clip that had circulated online, but the full sequence, including the conversation between Amara and Yaw in the car before the SUV reached the booth. in which Yaw outlined which executives he planned to approach at the memorial service and what he expected Amara to facilitate. Her voice in that recording was different from the voice she'd used in the library the day before. She sounded like someone being led somewhere she hadn't fully chosen to go. I noted that, set it aside, and focused on what the morning required. The emergency board session was held in Aburi Manor's formal meeting room, a long, wood-paneled space my father had used for exactly this kind of purpose, with a table that seated 20 and windows that looked out over the eastern lawn. Yaw arrived with the 2 board members who had signaled openness to his proposal. They came in together, which told me they'd already met that morning and agreed on their approach. Yaw positioned himself near the head of the table, with the easy confidence of a man who has rehearsed the room in his head and found it favorable. He opened by addressing the board directly. He said that the current situation, a contested succession, an active court order, a very public scandal, created conditions that were genuinely dangerous for the group's stability. He said that a controlled divestiture of the energy division would protect the asset's value while the governance questions were resolved. He spoke about fiduciary responsibility. He used the word stewardship 3 times. He was very good at it. I let him finish. Then I stood up. I said that before we discussed any transactions, I needed the board to understand the full context of what had brought us to this room. I would start with something I should have addressed a long time ago. I had concealed the truth of my identity from my wife for the duration of our marriage, and that was wrong. I wasn't asking the board to weigh in on my marriage. I was acknowledging it plainly, because what came next required them to know I wasn't standing in front of them as someone without fault. I wanted them to hear the rest from a man who had already accounted for his own failures. Then I nodded to Amma. She presented the material methodically. The communication logs first, then the transaction structure, then the emails. She walked the board through the timeline. Yaw's initial inquiries into the energy division, the identification of Amara's firm as a peripheral contact point, the documented approach to Amara, and the parallel engagement with the 2 board members currently seated at this table. She was precise and unhurried, and the room got very quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the people in them realize they have been watching something from the wrong angle. Then Amma played the audio. In the first recording, Yaw's voice was warm and reassuring. He was telling Amara that once the transition was complete, once they had what they needed from the group, they could move forward together. In the second recording, made 3 days later in a call with one of his financial partners, his voice was different. Efficient. Conclusive. He said Amara had served her purpose, and that he'd exit the personal arrangement as soon as the signatures were secured. He said it the way you discuss closing a position in a market you no longer need exposure to. Amara was seated near the back of the room. She had come in with her legal representative, and she had been composed until that moment. I watched her face when the second recording played. She didn't react visibly. No tears. No outburst. She just went very still, the way a person goes still when something they suspected but hadn't let themselves believe has been confirmed out loud in front of witnesses. I had seen that expression on her face once before, years ago, in a different context, and the recognition of it made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel in that room. Sorrow. Not for myself, for the version of her that had been taken apart quietly by someone who knew exactly which pieces to remove. The 2 board members who had aligned with Yaw did not speak for the remainder of the session. The rest of the board voted to reject the proposed sale, to suspend both members pending formal review, and to refer the matter, the data theft, the document alteration, the coordinated manipulation of a governance process, to the appropriate regulatory and investigative bodies. Amma presented the original, unaltered succession documents, and the board voted to formally recognize my authority as Nana Ose Aje's sole heir and the new chairman of the Aje Pan-African Group. The motion passed by a margin that left no room for ambiguity. Yaw left the building with his legal team without speaking to anyone. He didn't look at Amara on the way out. I asked Mr. Boateng to arrange a few minutes alone in the garden. The garden at Aburi Manor ran along the south face of the house. Bougainvillea hedges, old stone paths, a fountain that my father had never once turned off during the months he was in residence, because he said the sound helped him think. I was standing near the fountain when Amara came out through the side door and stood a few feet away. She didn't try to explain herself the way she had the night before. She said, "I knew something was wrong with him. Not at first. At first I believed what he was showing me. But somewhere in the middle of it, I knew. And I kept going anyway. Because I had already decided that whatever he was better than what I had." She looked at the fountain rather than at me. I think I told myself that for so long that I started performing it instead of feeling it. And I stopped being able to tell the difference. I thought about the hospital corridor. I thought about the drive in the rain. I thought about how long I had watched the woman I married slowly replace herself with someone she thought the world would take more seriously, and how I had kept waiting for the original to return, instead of accepting that people move in the direction of their choices, not their origins. I said, "Money didn't make you cruel, Amara. It gave you a reason to stop hiding the choices you were already making." I said it without anger, because by that point, the anger had been replaced by something more like clarity. I hope you figure out who you actually are when nobody's watching. I mean that. She went back inside. I did not use what I had to take anything from her beyond what was right. The divorce proceeded on the terms the law required. She received what she was entitled to from our shared life, not a cedi more and not a cedi less. She did not receive access to the Aje estate or its holdings. Yaw faced a federal investigation for securities manipulation, data theft, and coordinated fraud. The partners who had spoken warmly about him at industry events released statements distancing themselves within 72 hours. Efua discovered that the social circles she had spent years leveraging were no longer open to her. The women she had cultivated all knew she was the one who had dropped the bag. None of them lost everything because I decided to destroy them. They lost what they had been reaching for because they had built towards something that was never real. And when the structure underneath it gave way, there was nothing left to hold. The board stabilized over the following months, with a steadiness that surprised people who had expected a prolonged power struggle. I came to every meeting prepared. I asked the questions that the reports raised, rather than the questions designed to signal authority. I made decisions based on documents, not the pressure of the room. 3 months in, Amma said across the desk, "Your father spent 10 years earning this board's trust. You did it in 90 days." I told her my father had done the harder work, by making sure I understood what trust was actually for, before I was ever in a position to need it. I kept the garage in the industrial district. I still went back on weekends, still took on repair jobs when the scope was right. Not because I needed the income, or was performing some version of humility for an audience, but because those engines were where I had learned what I knew about the patience required to repair something the world had decided wasn't worth saving. That knowledge turned out to be more transferable than I'd expected. A portion of Aburi Manor was converted into a vocational training center, free, open to young people from low-income households, staffed by instructors paid properly, because my father had always believed that education delivered on the cheap produces results worth exactly what they cost. Unused land on the eastern section of the estate was developed into housing for staff families and veterans. I established the Nana Ose Ajay Foundation for Community Development, funded from group earnings, dedicated to repairing roads, school roofs, and clean water infrastructure in towns that the larger economy had quietly left behind. The first project was a workshop, a proper one, with new hoists and welding bays built for the apprentices of dancemen. One afternoon in late spring, I was standing at the gate, the same spot where my bag had hit the gravel, when Mr. Botang came to walk with me up to the house. He asked, the way he occasionally asked things he already knew the answer to, whether I'd considered replacing the old gatehouse, whether a new entrance might suit the estate better, given everything that had happened there. I told him no. The gate stayed exactly where it was. We walked up the drive together in the quiet that Aburi Manor carried in late afternoon, when the light came low through the tree line and the fountain was the only sound. At the front door, I looked up at the window of the study on the second floor, at the room where my father had sat in that chair and recorded a message for a son he trusted to eventually find his footing. And I said quietly, "I didn't hold on to what you built by destroying them. I held on to it by not becoming them." The door opened. I went inside. And maybe that's the thing worth sitting with. Not the gate, not the number on the inheritance screen, but the question of what we're actually building toward in the relationships we choose. Kwabena didn't lose his marriage the day Amara told him to get out of the car. He lost it slowly, across 12 years of quiet moments when respect started to disappear, and neither of them said anything. Money didn't create that damage. It just made it impossible to ignore any longer. The most powerful thing Kwabena did wasn't exposing Yaw in that boardroom. It was walking out of it without becoming the kind of man who needed to. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love to have you here for the next one.